Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for, yes, the Thursday night edition of the live stream. So, welcome everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. And there are a few things to discuss, so I want to get down to that right away. And obviously, the main uh, topic of the discussion will be the indictment of Raul Castro, former president of Cuba, and of course the younger brother of Fidel. Now, the reason why it's worth um, looking into this because it is so emblematic of the way the United States continues with its foreign policy. So it purports to seek some kind of a reasonable, rational outcome, a negotiated outcome. And every time it purports to do this, the United States introduces factors that ensure that there can be no reasonable outcome, there can be no negotiated solution, there can be no peaceful resolution. Um, and we've seen this time and time again. Of course, we saw this in the case of Milosevic, where everything suddenly, in the case of trying to resolve the problems of Yugoslavia, was now conditioned on the handover of Milosevic, because, of course, once the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was run by the United States and NATO, once they insisted on indicting Milosevic and insisted on Belgrade's handover of Milosevic, and of course, it meant that there could only be a violent outcome. And so the same thing goes here. It's hard to see how there can be any peaceful accommodation in Cuba when the United States insists on handing over Raul Castro, of course, kind of almost a kind of a legendary, mythical figure in Cuba, and there's no way in the world that they were going to hand over. He's a man, after all, who was 95 years old. I mean, but even so, I mean, he's the younger brother of the great Fidel. That just it's not going to happen. They're not going to hand it over. And of course, if they don't hand it over, then of course the United States is no longer obligated to provide any kind of assistance. I mean, they've been, Marco Rubio was talking, particularly during his video in Spanish. He was talking about providing humanitarian aid and working with Cuba's leaders on a peaceful transition and so on. However, once you issue this indictment, and once you demand that the Cuban authorities hand over Raul Castro, then of course there's going to be no aid. Worse than that, you've laid the groundwork for a possible military attacks that we saw in the case of Venezuela, and so therefore the United States will seek to justify any military attack on the ground that we have to enforce the rulings of U.S. courts. Now, as you know, the events that this indictment, to which this indictment refers, took place 30 years ago. It was in February of 1996. This was in Clinton's time. Clinton, was kind of an ineffectual president, just simply wanted to be keep everybody happy. But he nonetheless did try to improve relations with Cuba. Um, and the, the these various Cuban organizations in the United States, many of them, of course, funded by the CIA, funded by the U.S. government, were of course adamant in rejecting any rapprochement with Cuba. And so this organization, Brothers to the Rescue, stepped in and tried to ensure a dramatic deterioration of relations between the United States and Cuba. So what had happened was that the Clinton administration had made the flight of the passage of Cubans from Cuba to the United States a little more difficult than it had been before. So as a result, there were now fewer Cubans coming to the United States. So Brothers to the Rescue was founded by various characters who had been on the CIA payroll, um, from the 1960s on. So they set up this was an organization helping Cubans to flee. So they would pick up Cubans. It was called Brothers to the Rescue. So they would pick up Cubans at sea and then transport them to Florida. Um, but obviously, the Clinton administration wasn't too enthused about this. But they were even less enthused when this Brothers to the Rescue, which started engaging in various provocative acts against Cuba. For instance, dropping leaflets on Cuba and trying to incite uprisings within Cuba. Now, of course, any country, any government is likely to react quite strongly to outside forces trying to incite rebellion inside their country, and particularly the incitement of rebellion by people um, who had been and probably still were on the CIA payroll. So, in other words, the United States was agencies within the United States government were seeking to incite an uprising within Cuba. And so this was always going to end very badly. So when these Brothers to the Rescue, they sent their aircraft and they were dropping leaflets inciting uprising in Cuba, the Cuban government was going to react very strongly, and so strongly did the Cuban government react that they actually got on the phone to the Clinton administration and asked them, can you try and do something about this? So, we actually don't want to take violent, forceful action, but try to restrain this organization, this Brothers to the Rescue, and stop them from intruding onto Cuban airspace, and certainly to try to prevent them from dropping leaflets onto Cuba. And in fact, the Clinton administration did that, not very effectively, but they did try to apply pressure against Brothers to the Rescue in order to not to create a provocative a provocation that could then lead to some kind of armed confrontation with Cuba. But of course, that wasn't going to happen. That there would indeed be a provocation, and indeed, this two aircraft that were flown by Brothers to the Rescue were shot down, and some American nationals, as the media put it, were killed and that only then did the U.S. court step in and prevent any more of these actions by the by Brothers to the Rescue. You know, and but it was already, by then it was too late. But however, Congress went absolutely crazy in response to the shoot down, and they rushed through the Helms-Burton Act. You remember Jesse Helms, kind of figure from the 1980s, and but this was bipartisan. I mean, Democrats, Republicans, they all went crazy about this. Oh, the Cubans have killed some Americans. We got to rush this, tighten sanctions, tighten the embargo, and that's what they did. And so, whatever feeble efforts that the Clinton administration had made, towards some kind of rapprochement with Cuba, were then destroyed with the passage of the Helms-Burton Act. Anyway, this indictment that the Trump administration has introduced, and as I say, that puts paid to any talk that we've been hearing, that somehow there's going to be a negotiated transition, and there will be kind of gradual change of power, and that the United States would gradually lift the embargo, and there'll be oil would be provided, whatever. All of that is now gone. None of that is going to happen, because the United States will, as it always does, demand the handover of Raul Castro. And so here is if you look at the indictment, and you can see here, this is the Raul Castro and a few others, and the usual, we don't need to go through the usual accusations against Fidel. Anyway, so for the next several decades, this is after Fidel's takeover. So Cubans fled to the United States through the Florida Straits, risking their lives, and many times resulting in the death of those migrants in those waters on their journey to freedom. And then this Brothers to the Rescue. This is they flew unarmed Cessna aircraft to rescue or guide Cuban migrants stranded or lost at sea. So that was what they initially were doing, and they did it because they objected to the Clinton administration policy that was making it more difficult for Cubans to enter the United States. Anyway, it says in the 1990s, Brothers to the Rescue's flights also flew to support anti-Castro, pro-democracy movements in Cuba. So notice the way they kind of slip that in. You don't even notice it. You think, what do you mean? In the 1990s, the flights also flew to support anti-Castro, pro-democracy movements in Cuba. So in other words, these were flights emanating from the United States that were obviously geared towards provoking a confrontation in Cuba. They were essentially inciting an uprising in Cuba. So it's emanating from the United States, and people who were, unquestionably, these were people who were on the CIA payroll, who were inciting an uprising in Cuba. Well, yeah, I mean, the Cuban government was going to take a very dim view of this. And the Clinton administration knew that they were going to take a very dim view of this. But the indictment just sort of, mentions this in passing. How would the United States like it if, if there were flights entering U.S. airspace, emanating, from Mexico, say, or Cuba, even, dropping leaflets asking Americans to take up arms against the Trump administration. Anyway, this indictment goes on, and then around January 1996, Brothers to the Rescue flew unarmed Cessna aircraft in all around Cuban airspace and dropped pro-democracy leaflets that landed on the Cuban mainland. They just landed there, they just dropped them and they landed there. Okay, well. The Cessna aircraft used by Brothers to the Rescue flew at speeds significantly slower than the Cuban MiG fighter jets. In or around January 1996, the Cuban military, headed by Raul Castro, engaged in training missions during which Cuban MiG fighter jets located and followed planes with the flight speeds and at altitudes as those planes used by Brothers to the Rescue. And as we'll come to in a minute, I'll show you that the Cubans repeatedly warned the Clinton administration that 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 this was really, really annoying. And then in or around February 1996, pro-democracy groups in Cuba planned demonstrations in Cuba, and Brothers to the Rescue planned to support those demonstrations through flights to Cuba at the time of the demonstrations. The Castro regime did not permit the planned pro-democracy demonstrations in Cuba at that time and instructed its spies not to fly with Brothers to the Rescue during the planned Brothers to the Rescue flights in February 1996. On February the 24th, 1996, three Brothers to the Rescue aircraft flew from South Florida towards Cuba, and Cuban MiG shot down two of them in international waters, killing 4 U.S. nationals, including 3 American citizens. And then here, if you do, this is a lot of material is available now in the National Security Archive. And so here's a message from somebody at the FAA, the Cecilia Capestani. So, and she says, we have received information from the State Department that another unauthorized flight occurred in the morning. The plane, according to state, did not overfly Havana, nor did it drop propaganda. In light of last week's intrusion, this latest overflight can only be seen as further taunting of the Cuban government. State is increasingly concerned about Cuban reactions to these flagrant violations. So this is the Clinton administration, this is the FAA in the Clinton administration saying we're getting messages from State Department that they're very unhappy about what this Brothers to the Rescue is doing, that they're increasingly concerned about Cuban reactions to these flagrant violations. They are also asking from the FAA, what is this agency doing to prevent, deter these actions? As a matter of fact, the Undersecretary of State, this is Peter Tarnoff, I don't know if you recall the Clinton era, he was kind of a big noise in the State Department. Prevent, deter these actions. As a matter of fact, this is the Undersecretary of State, that's Peter Tarnoff, called Secretary Pena, who was the Clinton administration transportation secretary, Secretary Pena, last week to check on our case against Basulto. Basulto was the founder of Brothers to the Rescue, and as I say, he had been trained, financed by the CIA, and had worked for many years with the CIA. Anyway, worst case scenario is that one of these days the Cubans will shoot down one of these planes, and the FAA better have all its ducks in a row. And then we have another. This is again, this is provided by the FAA, chronology of events involving Brothers to the Rescue, and then FAA actions, 1992 to 95. FAA's flight standards personnel investigate individuals involved with Brothers to the Rescue, including this Jose Basulto, the president, founder of this organization, as a result of a number of incidents of accidents caused by failure to comply with FAA mandated safety regulations. Actions taken include safety meetings with these Brothers to the Rescue pilots, development of a safety program for Brothers to the Rescue pilots, and enforcement investigative reports. And then, so this is uh, 7/11. So this is now July 95. So the shoot down took place in February 96. So this is 7 months before. Miami Flight Standards District Office met with Jose Basulto to stress the consequences of unauthorized entry into Cuban airspace and to inform him that any violations of FAA or international regulations will be vigorously investigated and adjudicated. Further, every general aviation pilot filing a flight ban for July 13, 1995, for operation in the vicinity of a planned Freedom Flotilla demonstration will be notified of the consequences of any violations. All right, so then we go. This is now July 13, 95. Jose Basulto operated an aircraft on a passenger carrying flight departing Opa-locka, Florida. During the flight, he operated the aircraft into Cuban airspace when he did not have a clearance from the Cuban Air Traffic Control Authority for entry into an operation within that airspace. So you can see the Cubans are actually quite tolerant. That he flew into Cuban airspace in July of 1995. Jose Basulto issues a statement critical of the Clinton administration's policy towards the, quote, illegitimate Castro regime. The statement was also critical of U.S. government sanctions against Brothers to the Rescue pilots for airspace violations. Okay, so that's July 26, 95. And then August 24, 1995, FAA issues statement acknowledging receipt of August 21st, 1995 letter and supporting documents from the Civil Aeronautics Institutes of Cuba regarding violations of the Cuban aeronautical laws committed by this U.S. registered aircraft on July the 13th. The letter also expressed concern about the safety of the Brothers to the Rescue's planned activities for September the 2nd, 1995, and indicated that the Cuban authorities were considering canceling overflight operations over Cuba on that date. Okay. 29th of August 95, FAA issues statement announcing planned actions in anticipation of Brothers to the Rescue's flight activities scheduled for September the 2nd over the Straits of Florida. FAA actions include meeting with Brothers to the Rescue leaders to advise them that violations of FAA and international regulations would be thoroughly investigated and adjudicated. So you're not only violating Cuban airspace, you're also violating FAA regulations. The FAA also issues a special notice to airmen cautioning U.S. certificated pilots that they are subject to the actions of the Cuban government if they violate Cuban airspace. And then August 31st, 95, FAA official meet with Alfonso Fraga, principal officer, Cuban interest section in FAA Washington headquarters. The primary purpose of the meeting is to deliver an official FAA response to the August 21st letter received from the Civil Aeronautics Institute of Cuba and to provide an update on the status of the investigation on the July 13th incident. Anyway. And then we get into September. FAA issues a statement announcing notice of proposed certificate action issued on August the 3rd to suspend Jose Basulto, to suspend Jose Basulto's pilot certificate for 120 days for violations of FAA regulations. And then again, we go on into September the 6th, 1995, a National Transport Safety Board administrative law judge heard an FAA enforcement action against Carlos Gartner, who is associated with the Brothers to the Rescue, for a June 19th 94 low flight incident. The ALJ reduced the proposed 90-day certificate suspension to a civil penalty. FAA is appealing to the full National Transport Safety Board. And then, then it goes on. The FAA issues a notice to airmen advising U.S. airmen and operators to abide by FAA regulation as well as all Cuban laws, rules, and regulations in the Straits of Florida. And then so it goes on. And then now we get into January 96. State Department receives diplomatic note from the Cuban government in which it notifies concern regarding aircraft which allegedly entered Cuban airspace from U.S. territory without proper authorization. And then it says the Brothers to the Rescue claims having overflown Havana on 13th of January 96. And then finally, after this event of February, the shoot down of February the 21st, 96, which you can see came at the end of a series of kind of warnings, really both from the U.S. government and from the Cuban government. Finally, and then after the shoot down, the FAA issues this emergency order to cease and desist, an order of compliance against the Brothers to the Rescue, and says, on or about July the 11th, 1995, representatives of the Miami Flight Standards District Office met with Jose Basulto and advised him of the consequences of any unauthorized penetration of Cuban territorial airspace and advised him that any violations of federal aviation regulations or international regulations will be investigated, prosecuted, and adjudicated. Mr. Basulto was given a copy of the regulations governing operations in international airspace. In addition, the Miami Flight Standard District Office personnel placed Mr. Basulto on notice that every general aviation pilot filing a flight plan for July the 13th, 1995 for operation in the vicinity of demonstrations planned in the vicinity of the territorial waters and airspace of the Republic of Cuba would be notified of the consequences of entering Cuban territorial airspace. So they're just saying this is what happened back then in 95, but this is already after the February the 24th shoot down. So at the time of the flight described in paragraph 3, blah, blah, Mr. Basulto did not have authorization from the Cuban government Air Traffic Control Authority for entry into an operation within that airspace, contrary to and in violation of Cuban law and so on. The U.S. Department of State, Office of the Spokesman, issued a public announcement for immediate release on August the 8th, 1995. The announcement warned all persons that the Cuban government asserted its firm determination to take actions necessary to defend Cuban territorial sovereignty and to prevent unauthorized incursions into Cuban territorial waters and airspace. The announcement further warned that the Cuban government stated any boats from abroad can be sunk and any aircraft downed. And then it's just again, this is just repeating all of the in other words, they're providing a timeline of all of the warnings that the FAA had been issuing Brothers to the Rescue, before the February 96 shoot down. On or about August the 23rd, 95, the State Department issued a statement warning that entering Cuban territory, territorial waters, or airspace without prior authorization from the Cuban government may cause one to be subject to arrest or other enforcement action by Cuban authorities. The statement also cited an earlier statement on July 1995 in which the Cuban government warned that any boat can be sunk, boat from abroad can be sunk, etc. And then it goes on. This is August 26, 95. Basulto issued a statement critical of the U.S. policy, and then then it continues. And then again, October the 18th, 95, the Department of State issued a statement in which it advised Brothers to the Rescue that if persons enter Cuban territory, territorial seas, or airspace without authorization from the Cuban government, they may be subject to arrest or other enforcement actions by Cuban authorities for violations of Cuban law. The Cuban government has repeatedly asserted its determination to take actions it deems necessary, including the sinking of vessels. And then, and so on. And and then on January the 13th, 96, the Brothers to the Rescue confirmed the flight described and so on, claiming the aircraft overflew Havana and dropped anti-Castro leaflets. So this was completely in violation of Cuban law, and basically, no country would accept this. Anyway, and then we have on or about January the 13th, 96, the Reuters news agency reported that the Cuban government condemned the above described January the 13th flight that resulted in the violation of its airspace and warned that it would stop further incursions. And then so the operations of civil aircraft by Jose Basilto, Brothers to the Rescue, and unnamed pilots that operated civil aircrafts for Brothers to the Rescue were careless or reckless so as to endanger the lives and property of others. And that's on. So you can see from all of this material is that this whole operation by this organization was not only infuriating the Cuban government and forcing them to complain repeatedly to the Clinton administration, but the Clinton administration had been telling them not to go and do this. That you're violating Cuban airspace, you're violating their sovereignty, and it's not going to end well. So for the Trump administration, 30 years on, to make this into a criminal matter, when it's clear, from this record, that the U.S. government at the time regarded what Cuban government was doing was a defense of its national sovereignty. It's the integrity of its territory, the integrity of its airspace, and everything. So, in other words, it was the U.S. government itself that accepted that that the Cuban government was doing was defending its own national sovereignty, its own territorial integrity, the integrity of its airspace. But apparently that has been forgotten. And Trump, who now sounds like a deranged John McCain, Lindsey Graham, kind of regime change warmonger, has now has embraced the most extreme neocon hawkish view, and apparently now believes that it's legitimate for all kinds of creatures to violate the other countries' airspace and engage in provocative actions that can only end badly for pretty much everyone involved. Whether it's in this case these pilots, but it could have ended badly for Cubans, and it could have ended badly in that it could have provoked a serious armed conflict with the United States. So this is what the Trump administration has decided to make into somehow a cause against Cuba, and decide that now they've indicted a 95-year-old man and expect Cuba to hand over a 95-year-old man who clearly was acting in the interests of his country. He wasn't engaged in any terrorism. He wasn't engaged in any aggressive actions against anyone else. He was simply defending his country because he had reasonable fears that there were forces within the U.S. government, but certainly within the United States, that were trying to cause a political uprising or terrorism, or who knows what their plans were. I mean, I don't think that they were simply in the business of dropping leaflets. I mean, they had a much wider agenda, which is why the Clinton administration was really concerned about their activities. That it wasn't just leaflet dropping, but that they were seeking a violent uprising in Cuba. And in those circumstances, Raul Castro or whoever made those decisions within the Cuban government made the decisions that any other government would have taken in anywhere else. Anyway, this was the response of the Cuban government to the um, indictment. And here's, of course, the current president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz Canel Bermudez, and says the purported accusation against Army General Raul Castro, just announced by the US government, only reveals the arrogance and frustration that the representatives of the empire feel toward the unyielding resolve of the Cuban Revolution and the unity and moral strength of its leadership. This is a political maneuver devoid of any legal foundation, aimed solely at padding the fabricated dossier they used to justify the folly of a military aggression against Cuba. The US lies and distorts the events surrounding the downing of the planes belonging to the narco terrorist organization Brothers to the Rescue in 1996. It knows full well, given the abundance of documentary evidence, that no imprudent action was taken, nor was international law violated, as US military forces have indeed been doing with their coldly calculated and openly publicized extrajudicial executions against civilian vessels in the Caribbean and the Pacific. On February the 24th, 1996, Cuba acted in a legitimate self defense within its jurisdictional waters, following repeated and dangerous violations of our airspace by notorious terrorists, a fact of which the US administration at the time was alerted on more than a dozen occasions, which we've just seen. Yet it ignored the warnings and allowed these violations to continue. The ethical stature and humanistic spirit of his legacy demolish any infamy that might be attempted against Army General Raul Castro. As a guerrilla commander and as a statesman, he earned the love of his people along with the respect and admiration of other leaders in the region and the world. Those values are his greatest defense and a moral shield against this ridiculous attempt to diminish the stature as a hero. And here's a statement from the Cuban embassy. Cuba condemns the despicable accusation against the leader of the revolution. The revolutionary government condemns in the strongest terms the despicable accusation by the U.S. Justice Department and proclaimed for several weeks against Army General Raul Castro. And then the U.S. government lacks the legitimacy and jurisdiction to carry out this action. It's despicable and infamous act of political provocation based on the dishonest manipulation of the incident that led to the downing in February 1996 of two aircraft operated by Miami-based terrorist organization Brothers to the Rescue over Cuban airspace, which repeated violations of Cuban airspace for hostile purposes were of common knowledge. Furthermore, the U.S. government distorts other historical truth about the event. It uses as a pretext. It omits, among other details, the numerous formal complaints filed by Cuba during that period with the State Department, with the FAA, and the International Civil Aviation Organization regarding more than 25 serious and deliberative violations of Cuban airspace committed by the cited organization, Brothers to the Rescue, between 1994 and 96, in blatant transgression of international law and U.S. legislation itself. It also ignores public and official warnings issued by Cuban authorities about the inadmissibility of such violations of its airspace and alert messages conveyed directly to the President of the United States about the seriousness and possible consequences of such transgression, all of which is true, as we've just seen, absolutely true. And I only showed really the few highlights. I mean, all this documentation is publicly available. Cuba's response to the violation of its airspace constituted an act of legitimate self defense protected by the UN Charter, the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. And then the US, which has been the victim of the use of civil aviation for terrorist purposes, does not and would not permit the hostile and provocative violation of foreign aircraft over its territory and would act, as it has demonstrated, with the use of force. The inaction of the US government in the face of the warnings issued by Cuba at the time revealed its complicity in the planning and execution from its territory of violent, illegal, terrorist actions against the Cuban government and people, a recurring and systematic practice since the triumph of the revolution to the present day. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but they did. But it is true that the Clinton administration really didn't do very much until it was already too late. I mean, it was only then that they finally stepped in against the Brothers to the Rescue and prohibited any more of these flights. But nonetheless, up until then, despite the repeated complaints from Cuba, these flights continued, and so the FAA would basically they would comment on this, but there was nothing going on. They made few real serious attempts to prevent any more of these flights, knowing that there was a real danger that they would be they would be shot down by Cuba, and then that would create a serious problem for the United States, as in fact it did, and as it led eventually to unfortunately the Helms-Burton Act, which I mean the embargo against Cuba was already um, pretty ghastly. But the Helms-Burton Act just tightened it that much more. It was a response to what happened on February the 24th, 1996. But the events were provoked from within the United States, and now we have a complete revision of history, and somehow you criminalizing the United States is criminalizing an act of legitimate self-defense on the part of Cuba. And as I said, it's guaranteeing, absolutely guaranteeing, that there can now not be any peaceful transition, there cannot be any negotiated outcome, there can be no let up in the blockade. So Cuba isn't really getting any oil now, so somehow it's the country just basically is living from blackout to blackout, and then this is just going to continue. And anyway, here we have, and then it is highly cynical that this accusation is made by the same government that has murdered nearly 200 people and destroyed 57 vessels in international waters of the Caribbean and the Pacific, far from the territory of the United States, with a disproportionate use of military force for alleged links to drug trafficking operations that were never proven, which qualify as extrajudicial executions in accordance with international law and murders according to U.S. laws themselves. The spurious accusation against the leader of the Cuban Revolution adds to the desperate attempts by anti-Cuban elements to construct a fraudulent narrative in an effort to justify the collective and ruthless punishment against the noble Cuban people through the strengthening of unilateral coercive measures, including the unjust and genocidal energy blockade and threats of armed aggression. And then Cuba reaffirms its commitment to peace and its firm determination to exercise the inalienable rights of self-defense recognized by the Charter of the United Nations. Anyway, so that's I mean, it was always inevitable. I mean, these rumors about the upcoming indictment had been growing, and even as there were all the stories, that John Ratcliffe was in Cuba, that they're working something out, and there'd be some, But this is typical. This is typical of Trump. He did the same thing with Iran. People thinking, well, okay, we're now moving towards some kind of a negotiated outcome. There'll be a sort of peaceful resolution. There'll be something for everyone. For the Iran, there'll be lifting of sanctions. May even get some of their frozen assets back. The United States will get rid of the nuclear issue. Will be just put on the back burner. No, never happened. We just got bombing, and now and now more threats of bombing. So now that this is it. So here we're now going to be living with further and further threats against Cuba, further and further coercion against Cuba, and now the United States is just going to turn the screw against Cuba. Hey, you have to hand over Raul. I mean, without that, we're not going to negotiate anything with you. No talks. You have to hand him over, and that, of course, isn't going to happen. So, but it was entirely predictable, given everything we know about the Trump administration. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about is following on from what we were discussing the other day, which is the drones. Remember the drone issue? Well, as we discussed the other day, the Latvia and Estonia and Finland have allowed their territories to be used for Ukraine to launch attacks with against Russia. So they're basically they were using the airspace of the Baltic states and the airspace of Finland in order to attack Russia. Now, this was a nice gig. They were all very happy about it. These Ukrainian drones were hitting oil refineries, oil depots in Russia. But the problem arose that some of these drones had fallen on targets in Latvia. Now, the exact circumstances of why these Ukrainian drones hit targets in Latvia was a little bit unclear. And it was deliberately unclear because the response of all the spokesmen of NATO land was, first of all, to try to blame Russia for this, and then when they couldn't blame Russia, it was the Ukrainian drones. Then to assert that, of course, it was Russia that was directing these drones against Latvia. It was always very baffling how they were able to do this. I mean, on the one hand, these drones were actually hitting targets in Russia, and Russia didn't seem to be able to do much about that. But on the other hand, Russia was able to redirect these Ukrainian drones onto targets in Latvia. But either way, it was very embarrassing, and it caused the fall of the government of Latvia, because obviously the people in Latvia, the Latvian public, was under the impression that it could wage this war against Russia. It's all these missiles, drones flying above their heads. It didn't really matter very much to them. But now it did matter, because now these drones were landing in Latvia, and so they felt a little bit endangered. So the prime minister of Latvia decided to blame everything on, well, of course, Russia first and foremost, but then to blame her defense minister for not doing anything about the drones. Now, and we know they obviously, why we know that, of course, they were allowing Ukraine to use their airspace was that they made no attempt to take out any of these drones. They made no attempt to shoot down any of these drones. So these, how are these drones somehow reaching Russia? And neither Latvia nor Estonia was doing anything about them. And then, so the defense minister, at least the political party from which the defense minister came, there was a coalition government in Latvia. The political party was a little upset as to why he was being singled out to blame for a policy that was obviously a joint uh, government policy to allow Latvia's airspace to be used by Ukraine to hit targets in Russia. And they quit the coalition. She shook her fist and somehow blamed everything still on Russia. But all of this was really quite embarrassing because uh, this was Ukrainian. I mean, Ukraine is being funded, financed, armed, militarized by NATO. So it was all these. This is a NATO proxy, and these and this NATO proxy was now endangering the peoples of NATO. So NATO had to come up with some kind of a story that all NATO members could agree upon and to assign blame appropriately. And of course, if we look at the statements that have been issued by NATO land, you can see how nonsensical everything they're saying is. Because on the one hand, they absolutely, categorically, unequivocally, unconditionally deny that the Baltic states had given any permission for Ukraine to use their airspace. Well, the moment they do that, they're lying. And how do we know they're lying? Well, first of all, obviously, in practical terms, why didn't they shoot down any of these drones? And presumably, the appearance of drones in their airspace would be a matter of some concern. I mean, that's what really, when this ridiculous Latvian prime minister fired her defense minister, he said, well, why didn't you do anything about the drones? Well, because I didn't do anything about the drones because I was told not to do anything about the drones. But so we know that this was they'd given their permission to do this. But why we know they're lying is that the claim that never in a million years, never in 100 million years would we ever give permission for Ukraine to use our airspace to hit targets in Russia. We'll never do anything like that. And then you think, well, that's very strange. I mean, you've been bankrolling Ukraine all these years. You've been building up their drone capability for years. Ukraine now is the biggest drone producer in the world, thanks to NATO. NATO has been providing Ukraine with satellite information in order to enable Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia. So you finance, you arm, you train Ukrainians, you provide them with satellite intelligence, and now you ask us to believe that never in a million years would you allow Ukraine to use your airspace to hit targets in Russia. Oh, but you would allow your territory to be used to transport military equipment, which this has been going on for years. I mean, basically, military equipment has been transferred to Ukraine via NATO territories, whether it's Poland, whether it's Baltic states, but this has been ongoing. So therefore, the idea that you would balk at the thought, heaven forbid, that you would allow your airspace to be used to hit targets in Russia. I mean, of course, it's absurd. So you can see how deceitful they are. And so we've been having day after day of these pronouncements. They're all kind of saying the same thing from these NATO creatures. And then today, there was, yes, yet another NATO foreign ministers meeting. Yeah, they're always having meetings. They're NATO foreign ministers meeting in Sweden, and naturally, they had to address that issue. So first, let's take a look at what the various NATO flunkies have been saying over the past 48 to 72 hours. We got just remember before we go on why we know they're lying, because after the events in Latvia and the fall of the government in Latvia, suddenly, lo and behold, Estonia shot down a drone, not a Russian drone, a Ukrainian drone. Now, Estonia didn't actually shoot it down. It was NATO, Romanian fighter aircraft, obviously on a NATO mission, shot out of the sky this Ukrainian drone. Now, why did it do that? Well, because this whole thing had become a real embarrassment. So up until then, up until the fall of the Latvian government, no one was doing anything about these drones. But now they felt they had to do something. But rather than get people to wonder, well, let's look at the sequence of events. These Ukrainian drones that fell on Latvia, the fall of the government in Latvia in response, and then lo and behold, the very next day, Estonia shoots down a Ukrainian drone using NATO aircraft. And then so once you start putting that together, you can see that that they're trying to put together a story that all of them, every member of NATO can can memorize. Everyone right. You memorize a story. It's very, very important. And so, but still somehow they're going to blame it on Russia. But you can even see as they memorize the story that they're supposed to put out, how confused they're getting. So take a look first of all at this. This is a statement from our friend Ursula von der Leyen. And she says, Russia's public threats against our Baltic states are completely unacceptable. Let there be no doubt. A threat against one member state is a threat against our entire union. Look at that. A threat against one member state is a threat against our entire union. Russia and Belarus bear direct responsibility for drones endangering the lives and security of people in our eastern flank. See, this is what they're saying. You see, Russia and Belarus bear direct responsibility for drones endangering the lives and of security of people on our eastern flank. But you see, by saying that, they are in effect, because we know these are Ukrainian drones. This isn't anything we can argue about. They've accepted that these are Ukrainian drones that have landed in Latvia and Estonia. These are not Russian drones. Now she said, Russia bears direct responsibility. So when you say that, then essentially you are indeed admitting that these Ukrainian drones that are flying over Baltic airspace are flying with a view to hitting targets in Russia. There's nothing inadvertent about this. So Russia and Belarus bear direct responsibility. Europe will respond with unity and strength. We will continue reinforcing the security of our eastern flank with strong collective defense and preparedness at every level. Well, the last thing you're doing, of course, is you're not providing any security. Anyway, that was von der Leyen. And then, of course, there's Kallas, who chimed in. And here, listen to this. Claims that the Baltic states allow Ukraine to use their airspace are utter nonsense, and Russia knows it. You see, that's how you know she's lying. By the very fact that the claims that they would, heaven forbid, they would use airspace. Why would you say no? Why would they have refused to use it? Why are they? Because they're so eager not to be a party to the conflict? Give me a break. I mean, you've been a party to the conflict for more than 4 years. Why would you not allow your airspace to be used for Ukrainian drones? You never hesitate, almost every minute of the day, to express your solidarity with Ukraine, your love for Ukraine, your determination to see the defeat of Russia. Why would you not allow your airspace to be used by these drones? I mean, as I said, we know that you're providing Ukraine with these drones. We know weapons are going through your territory. We know NATO is providing Ukrainian drones with the satellite information to hit targets. But heaven forbid that you would allow your airspace to be used by Ukraine. Why? Why would that happen? That's how you know she's lying. Which is that claims that the Baltic states allow Ukraine to use their airspace are utter nonsense, and Russia knows it. So right away, you know, well, that's a lie. It's utter nonsense, and Russia knows it. Why does Russia know it? Why would Russia know it? I mean, you know, these drones came down in the Baltic states. Why would Russia know that the Baltic states would never allow their airspace to be used by Ukraine? Moscow's threats against the Baltic states are not a sign of strength, but of weakness. Russia is failing on the battlefield in Ukraine and is trying to intimidate us into reducing our support for Ukraine. The right response is to do the opposite, increase our support to Ukraine, and boost Europe's defenses even further. So here is increase our support to Ukraine and boost Europe's defenses even further. But we would never allow our airspace to be used to hit targets inside Russia. That's not who we are. Yeah, right. Anyway, then that's Kaya Kallas. And then we have Margus Chakna. He's the guy we talked about him on Tuesday, and he's the foreign minister of Estonia. And so he says today Estonia's, I guess, Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the Russian charge d'affaires to condemn Russia's ongoing disinformation campaign against Estonia and the Baltic states. So, no, disinformation campaign. It's an ongoing disinformation campaign. What is this disinformation campaign that Russia is waging? Russia continues to spread false accusations, threats, and deliberate provocations. Let us be absolutely clear. Estonia has not allowed its territory or airspace to be used for attacks against Russia. These claims are false, and Russia knows it. Oh, notice how they have they repeat a certain phrase. Kaya Kallas used that phrase. Now Margus Chakna uses it. These claims are false, and Russia knows it. So how did these drones end up in Latvia and Estonia? Estonia has not allowed its territorial airspace to be used for attacks against Russia. Well, what was that drone doing in Estonia? Why did the NATO aircraft had to take down those drones? And then he goes on. The appearance of drones in the Baltic region is a direct consequence of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. That doesn't make any sense. These were Ukrainian drones. The appearance of drones in the Baltic region is a direct consequence of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to defend itself against the aggressor and strike military targets sustaining Russia's war machine. So he admits it. He admits that. So having first said, go back here. He says here, let us be absolutely clear. Estonia has not allowed its territory or airspace to be used for attacks against Russia. These claims are false. Russia knows it. Next paragraph. The appearance of drones in the Baltic region is a direct consequence of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to defend itself against the aggressor and strike military targets sustaining Russia's war machine. Exactly. That's the point. That the appearance of these Ukrainian drones are the result of Ukraine hitting targets in Russia, using your airspace to hit targets in Russia. Now, did you explicitly say, yes, by all means, use our airspace, which is what he's doing here, this kind of legalistic, or we never gave our permission? Did they give it explicit agreement? I don't know. But they knew perfectly well Ukraine was doing this, and he admits it. He admits, oh, Ukraine has every right to hit targets in Russia. So when you say that, and then you say, well, that's the reason why there are these Ukrainian drones in Latvia and Estonia, you're admitting Ukraine is using Latvian and Estonian airspace to hit targets in Russia. So all your talk about, oh, this Russian disinformation campaign, you've just admitted it. Ukraine has every right to hit whatever targets, and which means they have every right to use the airspace of the Baltics to hit targets inside Russia. Otherwise, why bring this up? If you're going to say Russia is lying about our, that we gave our permission for the use of our airspace, then why do you immediately add the appearance of drones in the Baltic region is a direct consequence of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine? Ukraine has the right to defend itself against the aggressor and strike military targets sustaining Russia's war machine. That's it. And then it says Estonia will not be intimidated by propaganda or threats. So we got a little chihuahua. We will not be intimidated because somebody else is going to come in and fight our wars for us. A threat against one NATO ally is a threat against the whole alliance. Oh no! Notice again, he repeats who's that? Was that von der Leyen who said that? Yeah, where is it? A threat against one member state is a threat against our entire union. That's von der Leyen. And then this little jerk says, a threat against one NATO ally is a threat against the whole alliance, and our allies stand united behind us. Now, and then we had the president of Latvia, who rushed to meet the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, in a video conference to get NATO's support. And here we have the president of Latvia thanked the NATO Secretary General for his firm stance in refuting Russia's blatant lies and threats. Notice how they keep saying this, Russia's lies. It's always the case, What they accuse you of doing is what they're doing themselves. The fact that they keep repeating, Russia's lying, then you know they're the ones who are lying. Russia's blatant lies and threats, the president of Latvia expressed gratitude for the support and deployment of NATO allies in Latvia. But we're talking about Ukrainian drones. These are NATO-provided drones. How can you talk about the support and deployment of NATO allies, NATO's position, NATO's stance, when the problem that you had was Ukrainian drones coming down on your territory? The officials discussed further urgent steps to protect the airspace of the Baltic states and increased involvement of allies in protecting the eastern border. Protecting the airspace from NATO drones. And then we have Roberta Metsola. Roberta Metsola, I think we had a picture of her the other day. I think Marty, a good friend Marty, provided a picture of Roberta Metsola, who is the Speaker of the European Parliament. which is the European Parliament is of course a kind of a misnomer, because we're always under the impression that, well, the Parliament is a kind of it's a representative, the the embodiment of democracy in the European Union. But of course, the European Parliament has no powers. It cannot sponsor legislation. It's there to rubber stamp the decisions made by the unelected, undemocratic European Commission. So the European Parliament, they live very nicely in Strasbourg, but all they do is they issue these meaningless statements. And Roberta Metsola is the perfect exemplar of the uselessness of the European Parliament. And so here she sent out this tweet. Russia's intimidation and provocations against Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are unacceptable and heighten tensions in the region. We stand firmly with the Baltic states. No member state should be threatened by Russia. The security of the Baltics is the security of Europe. The EU must remain united, vigilant, and resolute against Russian attempts to destabilize its neighborhood and undermine European security. But what does that have to do with the fact that we had NATO drones coming down on NATO member states, and you had to call upon a NATO fighter aircraft to shoot out of the sky a NATO drone? What's that got to do with Russia? Anyway, here was the statement from the European Parliament. We thought this would be a useful time to say something truly stupid, and the European Parliament always steps up to the plate. And they hear Russia's unfounded allegations. They're unfounded, they're baseless. Russia's unfounded allegations. And as I say, that's how you know they're lying. Unfounded allegations. European Parliament leaders express full solidarity with the Baltic states. Full solidarity. And here's the statement of the European Parliament's Conference of Presidents in response to Russia's allegations against Latvia, as well as Estonia and Lithuania. And the Conference of Presidents strongly rejects the recent unfounded and dangerous allegations made by the Russian Federation against Latvia, as well as Estonia and Lithuania, including claims that the Baltic states are preparing hostile actions against Russia or allowing their territory or airspace or military facilities to be used for attacks against Russia. So this, apparently, this is so shocking and so horrific and so outrageous that they would ever do anything like that. Imagine, how can you accuse us of allowing Ukraine, our great ally, Ukraine, which supposedly is fighting for our values, fighting for European civilization? How can you possibly accuse us of colluding with Ukraine? We would never do anything like that. So this is no, absolutely not. And then they say, this is very funny. They say, this unfounded, no, including claims, no, absolutely wrong. And then allegations which Latvia has categorically denied as disinformation. So that's the basis of your claim that this is disinformation, these are all lies, because Latvia has denied them? That's it? Because how do you know all this is disinformation? We know, and no one's denying this, Ukrainian drones are hitting targets in Russia. Ukrainian drones are coming down in Latvia and Estonia. Ukrainian drones have been provided by NATO. So essentially, this is NATO using the Baltic states' airspace, territory to wage this war against Russia. There's nothing at all so startling about this. In fact, you would think, I would imagine that's what's going on. I mean, we know that this NATO has been using Ukraine to wage this proxy war against Russia. We know about all of the targeting inside Russia that Ukraine has been engaged in for years and years. That's all been facilitated by NATO. So you think, why this horror, this indignation? Well, there are two obvious answers to that. First answer is that many NATO countries, especially the Baltics, had imagined that they can do this, they can wage this proxy war against Russia without getting hurt themselves. So, we won't get hurt. It'll all just be, you know, happening, above our heads. We're not going to get hurt. And then suddenly, with these drones landing on Latvian territory, suddenly they kind of realize, hey, we are getting hurt. This war isn't cost free. So that's one issue. The other issue, of course, is that they were probably told by the United States that if you engage in these provocative actions against Russia, we're not going to be there to support you. It's the kind of thing the Trump administration would probably say, we're not going to be there to support you, so that you're going to have to face Russia by yourself. Now, this is the last thing they want to hear, and so what do? They somehow throw around a whole lot of fake indignation. We would never do anything like that. How can we possibly be accused of anything like that? And then to say, whoa, we're under threat. We're really under threat from Russia, even though these attacks have been on Russia using their airspace. So anyway, this is they say, whoa, this is absolutely shocking allegation. And then he says, these accusations form part of a broader pattern of intimidation, disinformation, and provocation directed against EU member states and are particularly serious in light of repeated incursions of unidentified drones into the... Notice what they've done here. It's serious in light of repeated incursions of unidentified drones into the airspace and territory of the Baltic states. But we're not talking about unidentified drones. We're talking about identified drones. So they want to, you remember we had all the hysteria about these unidentified drones, which immediately were all ascribed to Russia without any apparent evidence. So, they were unidentified, but they were obviously from Russia. So now they want to bring that back, that whole story about the unidentified drones, as a kind of a smokescreen, and not to admit that these are very much identified drones in their airspace. Such actions are unacceptable and contribute to heightened tensions and instability in the region. Well, who heightened tensions? Who promoted instability in the region? Well, the EU and NATO did by fighting a proxy war, and imagined that there would be no price to pay. And then they go on, the Conference of the Presidents expresses full solidarity with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. No EU member state can be threatened, intimidated, or subjected to coercive pressure by Russia. The security of the Baltic states is the security of the European Union as a whole. And then we call on the Commission, the High Representative, and the Council to continue supporting Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in close coordination with NATO in strengthening airspace surveillance, counter-drone capabilities, and situational awareness, and in reinforcing their capacity to prevent and respond to further incursions. But these incursions are coming from NATO. So, yeah, let's do all of that. But it's coming from NATO. These are NATO drones that we're talking about. That's where the incursions are coming from. But these statements, which we've just been reading out, they all want to suggest, and this is why they're lying, so shamelessly, they want to suggest that they're coming from Russia. So yeah, that's all. This is this is all Russia, and knowing the media will always just repeat, regurgitate this kind of stuff. But it's an entire kind of a giant distraction in order to confuse the public as to what had just happened. And then we call it. That's how blah, blah, blah. And so on. Destabilize. Brazil in the face of Russian attempts to destabilize the neighborhood, undermine European security, and divide member states. And then here's this guy, somebody called Tom Berenson. Tom Berenson is the foreign minister of the Netherlands. And he too weighed in, declaring today that the Netherlands stands in full solidarity with Latvia and condemns Russian false narratives and public threats. How does he know? I mean, it's amazing how they know these things. These are false narratives and public threats. Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine is the direct cause of recent incidents undermining the security and safety in the Baltic state. Again, he says this, they are the direct cause. So, in other words, he's kind of admitting it. Well, they're the direct cause. Well, these are Ukrainian drones, the Ukrainian drones that are in the Baltic states. The direct cause is what Russia is doing. So, you more or less admit, yeah, that essentially these are NATO drones being used against Russia, but Russia is the direct cause of this. Even as you admit, no, couldn't possibly be us. We would never do anything like that. We'd never allow airspace to be used against Russia. We have too much respect for Russia to allow them to allow Ukraine to do that. So this is Tom Berenson. And then this is Toyuwana. She's the Romanian foreign minister. And she declares Romania stands in full solidarity with Latvia following the drone incursions and the violation of Allied airspace. We condemn the Russian disinformation campaign that falsely accused our ally. So no, again, disinformation, falsely accused our ally. And it's falsely because Latvia denies this. Okay. Falsely accused our ally and partner in this context. NATO allies stand united against Russian attempts to sow discord. We also thank Latvia for its thoughtful contributions to our diplomatic conversations on collective security and the excellent collaboration in international missions on the eastern flank. This week's shoot down by a Romanian F-16 pilot over Estonia was also made possible thanks to the contribution of Latvian professionals on radars, a true show of international cooperation. Yeah, and as I say, that was NATO shooting down NATO drones. I mean, this was over NATO territory. That was good work, everybody. None of that would have happened if NATO were not doing something so idiotic and reckless as waging a proxy war on the assumption that somehow the United States will eventually come in and fight your war on your behalf. And then when you realize, well, that could well not happen, because Washington is just generally not in the mood, for all sorts of reasons, not in the mood to help out Europeans on the European continent. So suddenly, well, this isn't so much fun that was sending these drones into Russia, because, hey, we might find ourselves facing Russia on our own. So let's have this whole smokescreen about the Russian disinformation campaign. So anyway, that was this. The Romanian foreign minister, and so here was the joint press conference by Mark Rutte and Ulf Kristersson, the Prime Minister of Sweden, ahead of the meeting of NATO ministers in Sweden. Now, I've defended Viktor Orban on many occasions, and particularly now, we have this dreadful new government in Budapest, removing of Viktor Orban. But I do have a particular beef with Orban. So if you remember when Sweden and Finland were rushed through with their NATO membership, there was a real question about Sweden, because the way NATO works, there has to be unanimity among existing NATO member states to support a new NATO applicant. So first there was Turkey, and Turkey said, we're not going to support Sweden in its membership application because Sweden allows all these anti Erdogan agitators to set up shop in Sweden, and they allow all these various Kurdish organizations also to set up shop in Sweden. So Turkey seemed at first that it would say no, and then Viktor Orban joined in and said, "Well, we're not going to allow Sweden to join because Sweden has been relentless in its anti-Hungarian propaganda. It's been one of the worst proponents of the thesis that Hungary is oppressive and illiberal and despotic, the whole thing, and particularly on the issue of LGBTQ rights." And so, if you recall, there was a lawsuit filed against Hungary. It was filed on behalf of a number of EU states, and one of those EU states was Sweden. So Sweden was just very, very noisy, very vociferous in its opposition to Hungary. And then Orban said, "Well, if you're so unfriendly towards us, if if you dislike us so much, well, why would you want to be with us?" And so it was a real question. But then I thought, well, fantastic, great, let's keep Sweden out. The last thing we want is, obviously we don't want NATO, but the last thing we want is Sweden inside NATO. And then this same guy, this Christopherson, started making all sorts of pleas to Orban to get him to change his mind, and eventually Orban did indeed change his mind and signed off on Sweden's application, and then Sweden got in, but Orban should have stuck to his guns. I don't think Sweden should be in anything. To be honest, I think always contributes very little to the welfare, the common welfare security of Europe. And since it joined NATO, NATO has become more belligerent. NATO has become more Russophobic, more hawkish, and so, as I said, I can't forgive Orban for letting Sweden through. Anyway, there was Sweden, and Sweden didn't abandon any of its anti-Hungarian stance. Sweden continued in denouncing Orban, continued to denounce Hungary. So Orban didn't really get anything, out of this show of generosity. Anyway, so here was this news conference at at NATO, and here was this ahead of the meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Sweden. And so there's somebody, Terry Schultz, Deutsche Welle, says, "I have two questions. At this very moment, or within the last couple of hours, a drone has again entered Baltic airspace. A drone. I guess over Latvia this time. A drone. So, what can NATO do to deter Russia from redirecting these drones? All right. Now, let's step back a little bit. Here is this somebody, there's this person, he purports to be a journalist. He's from Deutsche Welle. He, first of all, accepts, as if it had been proven, even though it hasn't been proven, that somehow Russia is redirecting these drones. We don't know exactly what the circumstances are. Nonetheless, he accepts the premise. Obviously, Ukraine is not using the Latvian airspace. He accepts that. He accepts that Russia is redirecting these drones. Has he looked at any particular data to demonstrate this? And then, third, he then says, "Hey, what are we going to do to stop Russia doing this?" Why is a journalist, somebody who's working for Deutsche Welle, why is a journalist acting as a flag for NATO? Why is he instead of taking a dispassionate, disinterested approach to NATO, so, is saying, "Well, what are you going to do about about Russia's redirecting these drones? I mean, it's really, it's really causing us a problem." So this is the level of journalism today in NATO land. And what can NATO do to deter? We got to deter Russia, because it doesn't seem to be working. And at the same time, it's being reported that the JEF working on creating a sort of military command structure that could operate outside of NATO if necessary. You look surprised. Read The Economist. Let's read The Economist and others. So, I mean, I'm not optimistic on my answer I get from you, but if this is true, does this strengthen NATO? Why is the journalist again, why is he so preoccupied with strengthening NATO? Because it would then be a European pillar, a decision-making pillar inside NATO, or is that a sign that the alliance is more fractured? So then here's Mark Rutte. To your first question, I mean, Ukrainian drones are there not because Ukraine wants to work with drones. They are there because of the full-scale Russian attack against Ukraine and Ukraine having to defend itself. Notice what he's done here. Read this again. To your first question, I mean, Ukrainian drones are there not because Ukraine wants to work with drones. Really? They are there because of the full-scale Russian attack against Ukraine and Ukraine having to defend itself. So he's not, notice, he hasn't said that Russia's redirecting drones. So this creature from Deutsche Welle said, "Oh, Russia's redirecting them." Rutte hasn't said that. He said, "Oh, well, that's just, it's all, Ukraine doesn't want to use drones. They're just defending themselves." And then because Ukraine has having to defend itself, and NATO is always prepared for every eventuality. And what happened over the last couple of days, again, is what we trained and prepared for. And this is a calm, decisive, and proportionate response to any threat, and is exactly what happened through the Baltic air policing mission from Lithuania. When it comes to Latvia, when it comes to Lithuania, so that is what people can be assured of. NATO is always there to defend every inch of NATO territory. But this is NATO. These are NATO drones. And NATO had to shoot out of the sky NATO drones in NATO airspace. So that's this great accomplishment of NATO. And you notice again, he hasn't confirmed what this quote journalist unquote from Deutsche Welle had said. And then Terry Schultz says, "Well, how do you stop it?" Well, you stop it by making sure that anyone, of course, when it comes to Ukrainian drones, again, they are not there because Ukraine wanted to send drones. They are there because of this war of aggression by the Russians. This is where this all started. And when a drone, whether it is from Ukraine or from Russia, is presenting a threat. When a drone, whether it is from Ukraine or from Russia, is presenting a threat, then we are there to make sure that we do everything. Okay. So there's a threat from Ukraine. This is your proxy, your satellite state. And you're there to protect yourself from your own creation. You've kind of created your kind of Frankenstein's monster, and now you have to protect yourself from what you have created. So Rutte is kind of admitting that here. Not what the guy from Deutsche Welle is saying. This is what Rutte is saying. Here, then we have reporter. A quick follow-up on the drones. I saw the Polish defense minister today said that Ukraine must be more precise in using drones after we've seen the string of incidents. A comment to that, and then also for the Secretary General, Russia on Thursday delivered a nuclear munitions to field facilities in Belarus, and we are seeing exercises there. How does NATO assess this? And then, Rutte didn't say very much. So this Ulf Kristersson, the Swedish prime minister, he jumps in. He said, well, it's my firm belief that the Ukrainians are they certainly don't want their drones to end up on friendly territory for obvious reasons. Sometimes it's a matter of jamming. Sometimes it's so here we go, the jamming, they quickly jump in, the jamming. Sometimes it's a matter of other disturbance, and obviously they do not want them to happen because it could create damage, it could create fear, of course. But I think you should also realize that there's a Russian willingness to give the impression that other countries are kind of doing things that are not legitimate, and that's why we should really not be open for the Russian narrative on this, but instead, of course, to help the Ukrainians as much as we can, to help them direct their attacks in the right direction, of course. Let's go back a little bit. But I think you should also realize that there is Russian willingness to give the impression that other countries are kind of doing things that are not legitimate. And that's why we should really not be open for the Russian narrative on this, but instead, of course, help the Ukrainians as much as we can to help them direct their attacks in the right directions, of course. Well, that's very interesting. So you first say that, heaven forbid, we would never allow the use of our territory or our airspace to hit targets in Russia. No. And then the Swedish prime minister says, well, we need to help the Ukrainians hit their targets, hit them in the right direction. So why are you denying that you're allowing your airspace to be used by Ukraine? He says it. They're having difficulties. We've gone through all these different things that they've said. They're having difficulties to keeping their story straight. The Russian narrative, but instead help the Ukrainians as much as we can to help them direct their attacks in the right directions, of course. And then Rutte jumps in. He said, he hadn't really said anything. The Swede had taken over the news conference, so he then jumps in. There was this ridiculous claim by the Russians that Latvia was somehow supporting this. Totally ridiculous, and the Russians know this. That's it. You got the script. It's ridiculous. It's nonsensical, and the Russians know this. Always get the script. Somebody had told him, hey, remember your lines. And then it just went on to other things. So there it is. You have this entire giant distraction pulled by NATO, and but as you listen to them, they're more or less admitting exactly what the Russians said. So. The only real question then is whether they're going to uh, cut it out once they've been told. Obviously, the message came through that if you do these obviously provocative things, then and the Russians are provoked, because the Russians did kind of issue threats that they would respond to any attacks by Ukraine emanating from Latvia. This is specifically, they identified Latvia. We talked about this on Tuesday. That any attacks and their Russian response, they were told by the United States, if that happens, you're on your own. And then, having been told, you're on your own, lo and behold, NATO scrambles aircraft and shoots out of the sky Ukrainian drones. Anyway, let's now go to our locals page, this is where our community, is addresses itself condition of the dogs. And as I always say, if you want to communicate with me, if you want to me to address your comments, you want me to engage in any kind of argument with me, then please join our community, join the community, because it's a great community, and I don't have the ability to read all of the comments on YouTube, and I prefer to reserve my time for the members of our community. So please, the Gaggle.locals.com. It's great, great people. It's a great. Our board is so much fascinating information. I have difficulties keeping up with everything that's posted on our board. So anyway, Danaki, one of our earliest and most prolific contributors, says, so sadly, Miriam Adelson 1, Massie 0, Mazel Tov. Yes, so this was the unfortunate defeat of Thomas Massie on Tuesday, and I think, as we talked about this before the results were known, and I had a bad feeling going in, because he was really, Massie was struggling. He was ahead in the polls, but he wasn't ahead by the kind of margins that I would have liked to see. He's always won his primaries very easily in the past, and here he just seemed to be just ahead. In the end, his defeat was quite a substantial one. This was we were caught by surprise by the margin of the defeat, and obviously Trump is very happy, and he demonstrated his own power within the Republican Party, and it confirmed, if further confirmation were needed, that when AIPAC, when the Israel lobby targets a congressman or a senator, when it targets them, AIPAC and the Israel lobby almost always prevails. Now, people will say, "Oh, no, it wasn't. It was because of Trump. It was, that it was Trump." Well, maybe Trump's intervention was obviously quite influential, but Trump is himself completely now identified with these very Zionist donors. He is now completely identified with Miriam Adelson. He's identified now with Paul Singer, and he's identified with all of the Bill Ackman, with AIPAC, all of that big money, enormous amount of money was thrown against Massie. And that didn't happen. So I think the issue then, they say, oh well, it was because of Trump. Oh, it was Trump that was decisive. Well, Trump wanted to see him defeated in 2020. That failed. Trump wanted him, uh, has always hated him, and yet that didn't work in previous times because the Israel lobby hadn't mobilized in the way that it did so this time. And so, therefore, it was just the force against him was overwhelming. And as I said, this has happened in countless cases in the past. When so much money is thrown against you, then it's very, very hard to prevail. Now, I would say though that Massie made a mistake by embracing the Jeffrey Epstein case, because this wasn't really his issue. His issue is non-intervention. His issue is balanced budgets, low taxes, um, deregulation, no to Pfizer warrants, without judicial oversight. In other words, he was a classic libertarian. Those were his issues, and obviously he was also against aid to Israel, but this was based on his libertarian stance. He was against any aid to other foreign governments. So those were his issues, and then suddenly he embraced this cause of Jeffrey Epstein. Now the problem with that was, well, as I say, I think the evidence of the child sex trafficking rings was non-existent. It's never been proven that there existed this child sex trafficking. There wasn't really any evidence that he exploited unwilling underage females. I mean, it's just the females in his orbit were adults. They knew what they were getting into, and they got into it because there was money, contacts, and all sorts of things there in Epstein world. And there was no reason for him to embrace this issue of Jeffrey Epstein and to suggest that there was some dark international child sex trafficking ring with Jeffrey Epstein, and by implication that Donald Trump were involved in. And I think that hurt him because the Republicans, and this was a Republican primary, the Republicans may well have suspected that Massie had embraced this cause only in order to hurt Trump. And I think that's why it was a mistake, because up until when was this? 2025, when he suddenly embraced this cause. Up until then, Massie had never really taken any interest in the Jeffrey Epstein case. So if you're a Republican primary voter and you're thinking to yourself, why is Jeffrey Epstein talking about something they'd never talked about before? I mean, the Jeffrey Epstein case has been ongoing since 2007, 2008. So that's 18 years, and Massie had never really talked about this issue. So they said, well, why is he doing it? Well, maybe he's doing it just in order to hurt Trump. So these Republican primary voters do like Trump, whether we like it or not, or at least they suspect that the Democrats are out to get him. The Democrats are out to hurt him, and therefore they really don't want to give any aid and comfort and sustenance to the Democrats. They don't really want to hurt Trump. And they may well have just suspected that that's what Massie was doing by embracing the Jeffrey Epstein cause so vehemently. It just wasn't his issue. I mean, all of his issues: First Amendment, no to warrantless surveillance, no to foreign intervention, no to forever wars, no to wild budget, no to no to additional taxation. That's what we'd always assumed Thomas Massie was about. And now he's suddenly talking about Jeffrey Epstein. I think that hurt him. However, there's no question. What did him in was the amount of money that poured in against you. I mean, if you that so much. I mean, this is a primary. This is a congressional primary, and $33 million. I mean, this is just insane. So yeah, they've got a major scalp. I mean, there's no question. The fall of Massey is a major scalp, just as the fall of Marjorie Taylor Greene was a major scalp. So disappointing. Maybe he'll make a comeback. The idea that he's going to be run for president, I think, is absurd. He's not going to do that, but he may come back. He may challenge the incumbent at some point. I mean, who knows? He's still young. Maybe he'll challenge in another district. I think he may still have a career ahead of him. But no question, this was a disappointment. Anyway, thank you, Danuki. And here is Marty. Always good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much. And Marty provides us with a picture of Fidel playing baseball. Fidel was indeed a big baseball fan, and he really did love love baseball, which seems odd. And then Marty then provides us with a picture of George H.W. Bush throwing the first pitch. Now, George H.W. Bush was actually quite athletic, to the point of obsessiveness, and of course we remember how he collapsed into the lap of Japan's prime minister back in, I think, was it 1991? I think early 1992. It was, and it came about, I think, when he overdid it. You never want to, exercise is good for you, of course, but you never want to overdo it. You have to know your own limitations. And George H.W. Bush didn't really do that, so he exhausted himself, and then collapsed, and the whole world saw the image of the Japanese prime minister kind of lifting the American president's head, because his head had just fallen into his lap. Something and that obviously hurt Bush going into that race with Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton was obviously a much younger man, and though Bill Clinton didn't overdo it with the exercises, nonetheless, he was younger, and Bush just seemed old because he collapsed. Something very similar happened to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was also a fanatical jogger, big on exercise, and he too kind of, famously collapsed after a jog. And of course, once you collapse, you give the impression that, hey, you're not in great physical shape. And Reagan himself, also like Clinton, not exactly a big exercise person, but he seemed, in comparison with Carter, seemed quite vigorous, because he didn't do anything stupid. He didn't overdo it with the exercises. So Carter he looked vulnerable against Reagan. So anyway, that was Bush. It was Fidel, and I think yesterday was the centenary of his birth. So thank you so much, Marty. I really appreciate that. And then Anne-Marie, thank you so much, as always, for your generosity, and thank you, Anne-Marie, for all of your fascinating comments on music on Gaggle Locals page. And So that should be another incentive for lurkers, lurkers on YouTube or on X, for those lurkers to join our community, the gaggle.locals.com, because you have, this extraordinary level of expertise. And Anne Marie is precisely the kind of distinguished, eminent mind and artist that you would encounter here at the Gaggle. So she's an internationally renowned musician. She's a violinist of the highest rank, has performed in orchestras of the highest caliber in Europe, and has worked with the most eminent composers and conductors of the 20th and 21st centuries. So, very fortunate to have her here, because when she has the time left over from performing Bruckner or Wagner, or some of the most difficult musical compositions in the Western musical repertoire. So, when she's not performing those pieces, she's here at the Gaggle, and when she's also contributing to the Gaggle and writing the most fascinating pieces about her experiences of performing great pieces of music, and writing about the difficulties and the challenges that are involved in working with some of the great musicians, and working in what are often very difficult circumstances. The orchestras may be very distinguished, but the conditions under which they work are not always quite so distinguished. So we have Anne Marie to thank to learn. When we learn about those difficult conditions. So thank you so much, Anne Marie, for your generosity. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And as I say, please join the Gaggle, and then you get to learn from Anne Marie just as we all do. And then here is Cynthia, another one of the advantages of joining the Gaggle community, because Cynthia is, of course, an extraordinary film scholar, a film expert, and with an encyclopedic knowledge of film history, film production, just with an amazing ability to recount all of the challenges that are involved in filmmaking, and all of the difficult circumstances that filmmakers had to overcome to create some of the classics of cinema. And of course, we screen the classics of cinema here at the Gaggle. We every week. We always have some distinguished piece of filmmaking. And what's great about our screenings is we're able to watch an outstanding film and learn about the making of this film from Cynthia's very learned, very erudite comments. So we get the double benefit. You watch a great movie, and you learn a great deal about the making of the movie from Cynthia's extraordinarily knowledgeable content. So please join the Gaggle, thegaggle.locals.com, and enjoy Cynthia's commentary. This week we were screening White Mischief. It's part of our series about the films about the British Empire. And this was a kind of a very dark, very cynical murder mystery set in 1940s Kenya. And it's a it's a film illustrating the darker aspects of British colonial life. So it's a very interesting film, and great fun to watch. And as I said, watch the film and enjoy Cynthia's really scintillating comments. So anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. Anyway, Cynthia says, drones struck a UAE power plant this week while others launched from Iraq towards Saudi Arabia were intercepted. Larry Johnson says the attacks were likely Israeli false flags from a covert base in Iraq designed to pull Saudi Arabia and the UAE into war. China and Russia via Pakistan are pushing a Gulf security pact with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, making the strikes appear Iranian, could inflame Gulf states and derail the peace effort, divide the Gulf from Iran, and weaken Russia-China regional deal. I think there's quite a lot of truth in that. This attack on the UAE came from Iraq. It did come from Iran. Now, then everyone immediately jumped and said, "Oh, yeah, that was obviously coming from Iranian proxies. Therefore, Iran is behind this dangerous attack. You know, this is nuclear, the danger of a nuclear leak, and so on." But the evidence that Iran was behind this, I think, is very slim, because I don't really see why Iran would want to do this. Because right now, the Iran's in a reasonable place in that they have Trump in a complete quandary. Trump really doesn't know what to do. He wants to get out of this war. He wants to find some kind of a face-saving formula, but he's not really able to do that. If Iran were to essentially break the ceasefire of sorts, I mean, we don't want to get into a whole whether it's a ceasefire, but there isn't any kinetic action at the moment between the United States and Iran or the Gulf kingdoms. None of that is happening at the moment. It's at the level of the blockade. So it's for Iran. This is this is it's demonstrated their power that in that they now have the United States in a crisis of its own making. And Iran has done this. Iran has been very shrewd in how it's handled things. Iran has fought this war asymmetrically, just as it said it would. But Iran has also kept the high ground by retaliating, exclusively retaliating. That Iran will not be the first to lobby a missile and lobby a drone. Iran won't be the first to break the ceasefire. So what the story that somehow these are Iranian proxies who launched this attack on the UAE just doesn't seem credible. I don't see that Iran would want to do this. Right now, Iran is doing well, is being taken very seriously. There are all these mediators who are trying to work something through. Iran would lose the support of the mediators. Iran would lose the support of Russia or China if it were to launch an attack while there's a ceasefire in place. So I agree with Larry Johnson that I don't think Iran was behind this. I don't think any whatever the proxy, what they call proxies, but I don't think any armed groups aligned with Iran would now do anything that would put Iran in a difficult situation, because, hey, you've broken the ceasefire, and therefore you provide the justification for the United States and Israel to launch a retaliatory attack against Iran. Who wants to relaunch this war? Well, Israel does. I mean, Israel is quite explicit about this. They say this openly, that they want to start this whole thing up at any moment, and to hit Iran doubly hard, much harder than Iran was hit from February the 28th to April the 8th. So Israel is the one that has every interest to break this ceasefire. So I agree with Larry Johnson on that. That I think it is likely to be an Israeli false flag attack. Um, the Gulf Security Pact, I think, yes, China and Russia have obviously been pushing this, and obviously it makes a lot of sense for everybody in creating, a some kind of a, um, a security architecture whereby everybody is somehow safe from attack. I don't think it's going to happen. Unfortunately, I just don't see it. The Russians like to talk about this, and it's understandable why they like to talk about this. And it's in principle, I think it's a good idea. But just as in Europe, there isn't going to be a security architecture. There's not going to be a Helsinki 2.0. There isn't going to be some kind of a security framework where everybody's security is guaranteed. It's not going to happen. I mean, Russia has been talking about this for decades, and it's not going to happen. NATO has no interest in this. The Americans have no interest in this. Every time the Russians have brought this up, basically they said, we're not interested. And I think the same thing is going to happen in this case, which is we're not interested. So that means that this continues, that the situation will continue, and without any obvious resolution. Um, because I don't think the United States is going to go for a security architecture. We know the United States isn't interested in it. Here was, and that's why this goes back to the what we were talking about at the beginning of this live stream, which is Cuba, where it seems like the United States is talking about some peaceful transition in Cuba. The end of the communist government, and a dramatic improvement in the lives of ordinary Cubans. Well, that isn't going to happen. The United States jumps in and says, no, 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 you have to give us the head of Raul Castro, knowing that Cuba will, of course, say no. So, in the same way, the obvious remedy, which I think, obviously is that, yeah, we need a security architecture according to which nobody feels threatened. Well, Israel's not going to accept this. There's no way Israel is just going to accept Iran being a kind of an integral part of the Gulf security system. Israel will never accept this. And if Israel doesn't accept it, then the United States will not accept it. So it just isn't going to happen. Russia and China can talk, they can talk a good game. And I want to talk a little bit about but we'll discuss this maybe over the weekend or maybe next week about the Putin Xi summit, when they also discussed this thing about the security architecture. So I think that's something that requires a lengthier discussion. But that isn't going to happen. That the West and the United States isn't willing to accord anyone else that any kind of guarantees or any real respect. They expect subservience, and so I don't think I don't think this is coming to any conclusion anytime soon. I don't think the war in Ukraine is coming to any conclusion anytime soon. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Cynthia continues and says, reports indicate the UAE hit an Iranian desalination plant in March, though the UAE denies it. According to Mario Naufal, Emirati officials worry Israel is trying to drag them deeper into war. Well, I think that's a reasonable concern, because UAE is indeed very vulnerable to Iranian attack, as we've seen. And the UAE doesn't enjoy any kind of a security arrangement with the United States. So Israel has that. Israel has the United States in its corner. So if Israel is in trouble, into serious trouble, the United States probably, almost certainly, would go to war on behalf of Israel. Something similar in the case of Saudi Arabia. Hard to know exactly how that would play out. But the UAE, that doesn't have anything. So yeah, there's a historic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Obviously, an intense relationship with Israel, but there's no relationship between the U.S., United States, and UAE. So the UAE has every reason to be concerned about being dragged into a war with Iran. Despite active diplomatic and security ties, UAE trust in Israel has collapsed, leading officials to suspect Israel used a false flag to blame them for the strike. Yeah, could well be. Larry Johnson adds prior attacks on Turkey and Azerbaijan were likely Israeli false flags meant to force both nations into a war against Iran. Oh, that I agree with. That I agree with because it didn't seem like I absolutely don't see why Iran would attack Turkey. That doesn't make any sense, and I don't see why Iran would attack Azerbaijan. I mean, well, I'm not. I don't know about Azerbaijan because I can understand why Iran might uh, send a warning shot to Azerbaijan because there's always a danger. Israel and Azerbaijan are allies, and and there's always the possibility that Israel and Azerbaijan together would act against Iran. So it's quite possible that Iran would send a warning shot against Azerbaijan, warning them off getting involved in this war. So I think that's a possibility. I mean, because Azerbaijan is really it's a small country. Um, it doesn't have the resources to fight a war against Iran. So Iran could just simply say, "Hey, stay out of this." There are a lot of Azeris who live in Iran, so I think it was just a. I think I can believe that Iran would send a warning shot against Azerbaijan. I don't think it would do it against Turkey. Turkey is just very strong, has the strongest army in NATO next to the United States. It doesn't make any sense for Iran to want to provoke a war with Turkey. So the Turkey thing, I think it was a false flag. I'm not sure about Azerbaijan, though. And then Cynthia asks, a very good question. What film do you have lined up for our next screening? Or will you give us another theme movie shortlist to vote on? If so, what genre or cinematic? Well, as things stand, according to the polls, we have another runner-up, and I think this will be the last of the runner-up because I think we have another runner-up, which is The Man Who Would Be King and The Four Feathers. And of the two, I think it's worth doing The Man Who Would Be King because it's quite a well-made film. It's based loosely on a short story by Rudyard Kipling, and it's set in India. It has Sean Connery and Michael Caine. Everybody likes Connery and Caine, and I think it's be worth watching, and I think that will bring to an end the British Empire series. I think we've done a number of them. We've done Gunga Din, we've done White Mischief, we've done Khartoum, and then we'll do this one, which is The Man Who Would Be King, and I think then we'll just call it a day. So to answer the question, Monday I think is The Man Who Would Be King with Sean Connery and Michael Caine, and then that'll be the end for the British Empire. If Cynthia, if you have an interesting idea for a theme, so that we can have a poll on on the basis of a theme, we can choose 8 films to vote on. I always welcome suggestions for a poll. The last one, the one we did on the British Empire, that was in order to mark King Charles's visit to the United States. So if there's something in the news that you think could be, we could tie a movie poll on some theme on which we could have a movie poll. I'm always welcome to suggestions. If you don't have a suggestion, then I'll think of something. But I love entertaining suggestions for a theme for the next film screenings. Anyway, The Man Who Would Be King. Everybody, Um, very much worth watching. It'll be on next Monday, and enjoy Cynthia, who obviously knows a great deal about the film and who will tell us, you know, a lot of things that I certainly don't know, and I think I'm sure most people don't. So it's going to be an interesting and fun evening, and it's going to be on the Gaggle. So join the Gaggle, vote on these movies, and above all, enjoy the great content we have here on the Gaggle, thegaggle.locals.com. Anyway, my time is up. Thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you for all of your comments, questions, observations, and thank you for those who put something into the tip jar. Obviously, we have the issue of the dogs. I mean, I have to address their concerns because they only have one concern, which is, hey, why isn't there more in the tip jar? So I have to explain myself. Then they're never convinced by my feeble explanations, but you know, I can't persuade everybody. Anyway, over the weekend we'll do some more podcasts, and then next Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we're going to do a joint live stream with Peter. And then next Tuesday, it'll be time for my solo live stream. And look forward to seeing you then. Before that, Monday, the man who would be king. Until then, all the best. Goodbye. See you.